I'm not surprised we have a full house here because I've done a lot of these panels on a lot of issues, and I can tell you that unsolicited over the past week, I've gotten emails, tweets, documents, links to stories from people who care deeply about this issue. And one of the things we're going to talk about a little bit is, because this room is full of people who have deep connections to this issue, we're also live streaming. So there are people who are watching this who, for the first time, are discussing this issue or learning about it. So we're going to walk the fine line between deep in the weeds and the big, broad questions. But that said, there is going to be an opportunity for questions at the end of our conversation. So if there was ever a subject where a simple question, a one-word question fits, it's this one: why? But I want to become very precise. I'm going to ask this to each of you, but I want you to answer it through the lens of the way you experience this issue. You as a district attorney, you as a journalist, you as a former legislator and an advocate, and you as someone who's lived through it. So Steve, why do we have this issue in Oklahoma from your perspective as a district attorney?
Well, I have the benefit of being a prosecutor for over 28 years. Started out in a rural jurisdiction, now I'm in Tulsa County urban. I have, based on anecdotal evidence, just kind of perceived what was going on when I first became a prosecutor. Back in the late 80s, we were beset with a new drug, crack cocaine. I often refer to it as kind of having the perfect trifecta of factors: inexpensive, easy to manufacture, and highly addictive. That was a game changer in most respects for what you're seeing in courts. You follow that up with methamphetamine. At the beginning, it was quite an involved laboratory, but now you can make it in a pop bottle. Once again, highly addictive, easy to manufacture, inexpensive. Throw into that now what we're dealing with, which is opioid epidemic, prescription drug epidemic, and you have this what I would call tsunami of people getting addicted much earlier than we ever dealt with in the past. From that perspective, you would find that prosecutors and judges were observing those problems and were bringing those things to the attention of the legislature. We were urging them to look at what is getting ready to happen, because at some point I knew 20 years ago, you could see this happening unless we had some modification in the laws to address the difference between highly addictive drugs and the need for treatment versus all other crimes. So here we are, right? We're here because of a lack of action, at least in my opinion, on trying to address it when we saw it coming back in the late 80s and into the 90s.
The drug issue. Kris, for you, as a former legislator and now as an advocate for helping people re-enter their lives, why do you have these numbers in Oklahoma?
If the question is, why do we have the highest female incarceration rate in the nation in Oklahoma, I would say it's because historically our elected officials have tended to be reactive instead of proactive. We've historically based decisions on emotion and fear and anecdotes when it comes to criminal justice matters, rather than on data and on research and on facts. Another big problem in our state is that we have failed to recognize addiction and mental illness as a health issue, and we have instead chosen to punish people who battle addiction and mental illness rather than treat those issues properly with health care. The last factor I would mention is that our elected officials, and this goes for those serving in the legislature and statewide office, our district attorneys, our judges, and so on, have seen political value in being quote-unquote tough on crime instead of being smart on crime.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Patricia, you lived through this. You've seen this firsthand. Why do you think, from your perspective?
I definitely think there should be more, I don't want to say like help from the state for like young mothers and girls, more just more opportunities at programs to help girls get their diploma, get jobs, get these girls like ready for the real world instead of, I feel like I was like a left behind kid in the school system. So when I turned 16 and had my son, I got kicked out of school. So I ultimately went to the alternative would be different if we started there with like the girls being younger. Because like I said, a lot of those girls in there were in there for a man, and not once, twice, but 3 times now. And then like me, I have such a harsh sentence, which I think is so unfair, because you can't tell me that I need to be in prison for 12 years for selling marijuana to feed my kids, when you have rapists out here that are raping little kids and taking installment plans in prison. That means getting out, doing the same thing, and coming back. So you can't tell me that.
Ziva, I saved you for last because you're the journalist in the room. You're the person who has been diving deep into the data, and your project you've been working on with your colleagues has done something that is hard to imagine that someone hasn't done before. You actually crunch the data. And if we can get one of the first slides up so that we can talk a little bit about, so people can have a visual for the number of women incarcerated in Oklahoma versus the number on a national level. Okay, it's over there. Tell me a little bit about what your data tells us. Who's incarcerated, why they're incarcerated.
Sure. So we spent 18 months on this project, and most of that was spent convincing Department of Corrections that we needed all of the data, not just part of it. And there were deep flaws in the data. They were trying to help us as best they can, but it's a large data set going back 20 years or so, more than 1 million records. And so at the Center for Investigative Reporting, we have a really great data team that just spent a lot of time diving into this. And so, the first thing we started off with was the female incarceration rate. That's a rate per capita. So the most recent figures are 151 of every 100,000 women in Oklahoma are in prison. And that number, we've been number 1 since 1991. That has never changed. So you can see the way our rate there on top is going up, and the U.S. rate's going sort of not increasing as quickly. The main finding we had was that the most common reason women are locked up are lower level drug charges. So possession of drugs and possession with intent. And for those charges, the sentences are actually increasing in everywhere except Tulsa. So in the last decade, yeah, it's interesting. Something is working in Tulsa. So in the last decade, 9 years or so, the sentences for possession and possession with intent have increased 30% roughly statewide, and in Tulsa they've gone down quite a bit. So we have some slides on that. So when you lock more women up, and more women up for longer periods, you're going to have a higher rate. The receptions of women coming into the OC fell by half coming from Tulsa County during the 10 years that we looked at, and it continued to increase everywhere else. So the good news is something is going right in Tulsa County, and that's a model that I think works according to our data.
Is there a common denominator among these women?
We did find a very uneven system of justice in this state. So you found cities like Tulsa and Oklahoma City that have programs that help women, that provide treatment, some better numbers there, but it tended to be in rural areas, you had longer sentences. Poor women, definitely. Women of color definitely were overrepresented in prison. So Native women especially were locked up at 3 times their rate in the population. Black women twice their rate. And so you have poor women and women of color definitely paying the price.
Okay, I want to get back to that issue in a second, but I do want to bring Steve into the conversation. And I had a fancy question, but I'm going to tell you a story instead. My cab driver on the way over asked me what I was doing. I told him. He said, I got stuck up by druggies at least 3 times a month who don't pay, and I'm trying to feed my family. I'm working 12 hours a day. I want to see them in jail. But then he said by the end of the ride, but we got to do something for them too, because they have a drug problem. How do we balance this, Steve?
Okay, well, I want to respond to something that Kris had said. I mean, when you can say you need to be smart on crime, you also have to look at what the laws are or how they're written. In Oklahoma, like many other jurisdictions, we have kind of what you might think is a 3 strikes you're out. So prosecutors are duty-bound to follow the law. You don't get to elect to say, I'm not going to choose to follow the law. You have somebody in front of you who's clearly violating the law, and they are now at that point of committing their 3rd, 4th, or 5th, or whatever it is. You can't pretend that the law says that person should be incarcerated, and yet that was the issue that we were broaching with the legislature back in the 80s and 90s as this is a problem, you need to deal with it. So Prosecutors and judges were the ones who were on the forefront of implementing alternative court programs like drug court, DUI court, mental health court. I think one of the things that is lost on the equation is there's always a backstory to the possession charge. Somebody saying they've gone into prison because they had simply possessed something. Prosecutors and law enforcement are often armed with a lot more information. Was that person possessing that drug in the presence of children? Did that prosecutor, in order to work the case out, agree to drop it from a distribution charge to a possession just to get the case moving forward? So sometimes there can be a misidentification of what the true factors were. Was this person involved in gang activity? A lot of different factors that would weigh into it. In addition to that, there are distinctions between working within an urban jurisdiction versus a rural, and I pointed this out to Ziva. When you're in a rural jurisdiction and you're a business owner or you're a neighbor to this person who's continually thieving or committing crimes, at some point, where the prosecutor or the court may be trying to work with this person and get them rehabilitated, but they are not choosing to get rehabilitated, they keep on going and breaking into people's homes or their cars or committing their criminal conduct. In those jurisdictions, everybody knows everybody. And so at some point, the reality of those people in those jurisdictions, those towns, those cities, they're like, hey, prosecutor, or hey, law enforcement, why aren't you doing something about this person who keeps on victimizing me?
That sort of gets to the point that my cab driver was making, that
Right.
he doesn't want to get stuck up. He's got to support his family. But at the same time, he recognizes there's a drug issue. Back to the original question, what can be done?
Okay, so we talk about female incarceration, but I have been railing against the machine for decades now. We see the end product, what the problem is, but if we're truly serious about rehabilitating the system, we need to take the money that we're spending on the back end. I agree with Kris about the reactive part, and we need to throw every dime of that money on the front end. When police are going out to homes and there's domestic violence, there's neglect, there's drug addiction issues, not enough to maybe charge somebody with a crime, not enough to pull children from the home, you can still file a deprived children's action, bring that family into court, and start mandating those parents to start learning that their bad behaviors are only going to create a byproduct of children who are being deprived of the lives they're entitled to. So if we're meaningfully trying to solve the problem, meaningfully, if we are all honest with each other, we should be spending our money where we can make the greatest long-term impact, which is getting involved in the lives of children who deserve the protection. I'm very fortunate to have a program in Tulsa County through the Kaiser program, the Women in Recovery.
Yeah.
One of the most shocking things that I heard at the first graduation that we had, all these women who were graduating and walking across the stage, one of the most shocking things that you would hear to these women was they would attribute their drug issues to being a victim of child abuse in their minority.
Mm-hmm.
You'll have Mimi Trash up here at some point. I'm confident that she will relate to you the high percentage of that correlation. More to reemphasize what I'm saying, we need to attack the problem where the problem begins, and that's with our children, and help those children.
Yeah. I know that's the place where you and Kris do agree. And Kris, something I'm interested for you, because you've had an interesting career here as a legislator and now as an advocate. You started really making noise about this years ago. So what's changed between, let's say, 5 years ago and here in 2017 that there has been some movement towards addressing the issue?
So the conversation in Oklahoma that's occurring is at a higher level. I think that more people understand the value of addressing issues of addiction and mental illness with treatment rather than punishment. I think more families are affected and impacted by incarceration. And I think that we have reached a point among the people who live in Oklahoma that collectively the voters, the citizens have said, time out. We have to approach this issue differently. I will tell you that spending for corrections in the state of Oklahoma has increased 172% in the last 2 decades. Our state has a balanced budget amendment, which means that the state legislature cannot appropriate more money than it takes in a given fiscal year. What that means is this: the more money we spend on corrections, the less money we have to spend on education, or health care, or infrastructure, or services for kiddos who are in at-risk situations. So the fact that we're having some budgetary challenges, the fact that more people are negatively impacted by either a felony conviction or incarceration itself, I think has caused a discussion to occur that has really begun to change the way that we look at this issue in Oklahoma, coupled with the fact that community leaders and state leaders and opinion leaders have stepped up and said enough is enough. We ultimately have to chart a different approach, a better approach when it comes to dealing with criminal activity within our state. The last thing I would say is this: the validation of my points probably come in the fact that last year a coalition within our state decided to kind of bypass the political gridlock that has led to the highest incarceration rates in the state and take this issue directly to a vote of the people by reclassifying low-level offenses such as addiction, simple drug possession, simple property crimes from felony convictions punishable by incarceration to misdemeanors punishable by treatment, and then redirect the money, the savings, as Steve was saying, back to local communities to invest in treatment and mental health care. And those initiatives passed, the people of Oklahoma voted in favor of those initiatives by almost 60%. So we're seeing a change. We're seeing a change, and we're experiencing that change primarily in part because of these kind of conversations.
But isn't there a certain sector of the population that thinks that 780 and 781, that maybe voters didn't know what they were voting for?
Of course, yeah. There is a significant disconnect among some of our elected officials and the will of the people on this particular issue. There are individuals, there are organizations, the District Attorney's Council, who oppose and are trying to repeal these state questions. So there is some resistance. We're well aware of that. But we believe, based on not only what the voters have said, but also some of the success that other states who have already implemented these kind of reforms have experienced, that we're going to achieve the same kind of positive outcomes in Oklahoma if we can just give these ideas, these reforms, these initiatives a chance to work.
Ziva, you want to jump in?
Just quickly, one of the things we found in our research were we looked at reforms in other states, especially conservative states that had reformed their sentencing laws, cut sentencing time for drug possession, and about half a dozen states had both reformed their sentencing laws and their crime rates had gone down. So they were spending less on corrections and locking people up, treating more people, and their crime rates had dropped. Georgia was a specific example that really jumped out. But I think the other side of this coin is, and Steve and I were talking about this, is that money really does need to go to treatment. We've had the experience in Oklahoma of reforming, let's say, the mental health system, and those people are all supposed to get treatment in community settings, and then the money sometimes doesn't make it there. So I think a good question to ask is, how are they going to capture that money, make sure it actually goes to treatment?
Steve, that was one of your concerns, right?
That's really good.
That was one of your concerns, where the savings are going.
Sure, and I'm going to
Or maybe going.
I'm going to respond a little bit to what Kris is saying.
I know.
You know, many people in this state, when Proposition 780 passed, their perception was we were decriminalizing or making marijuana a perpetual misdemeanor if you possessed it. Very few people, in my experience, actually realized that law actually made drugs like crack cocaine, PCP, heroin, methamphetamine, all perpetual misdemeanors. The net effect of that is, and I brought this to the attention of Mr. Steele when this was an issue, was we have now the most liberal drug possession laws in the country. California enacted similar legislation, and they are seeing some of the net effect of that legislation, where their drug court programs are evaporating. And that's one of my biggest concerns, is with all the effort that we put in to try and get people into these drug court programs, when they're only charged with a misdemeanor, those people are not going to avail themselves to the treatment they need, which we know takes time. In Tulsa County, the average time it takes to satisfactorily complete the drug court program is 18 months to 36 months. Once those people graduate, they're moving on to productive lives. When you make the maximum exposure punishment to 12 months on a misdemeanor, you're eviscerating all the research that says you need a lot more time. So while there may be some pros to the idea that we need to look at some of these drug crimes, the flip side is you can't overreact to the problem. It also affects my ability to prosecute gangsters. You know, Al Capone didn't go to prison for murdering people. He went to prison for tax evasion. Well, when I have a gangbanger who is victimizing people in a community, and I can catch that guy with methamphetamine or crack cocaine, I can put him in prison. Now I can't. So now they are now emboldened to remain in the community.
I know this is an ongoing conversation, but I do want to move on because we do have a lot of other things to talk about. If we could get the slide up that looks at the racial disparities, this is something Ziva brought up earlier. And black women are incarcerated twice the rate to the representation in the state. Native American women 3 times the representation. Patricia, this is a unique opportunity. I'm a black woman talking to a Native American woman. This doesn't happen that often. Real talk, why is this?
My mother is black, actually, and I think that played a big part into her getting sentenced. And when they put up 100 cases.
Oh wait, your mic. You know what? We want to get you a mic because your mic is doing something. It's not working correctly.
Out of Kingfisher County, when they put up 100 cases.
Can you hang on one sec?
It's okay. We want to make sure we hear what you have to say. We'll fix it.
Is it on the side?
There's a
It's
delay.
on.
There you go.
It's on now.
Testing.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Okay, so out of Kingfisher County, Josh Welch.
Why don't you know what? Start at the beginning because we really didn't hear the top of what you said about your mom.
Oh, okay, yes. My mother is black, and so I'm on both sides. I did not know the statistics that you brought up about the Native American women. I did not even know that. But I think that my mother's being black played a part in our case out of Kingfisher County. So my lawyer put up 100 cases, almost similar to ours, okay? The only one that really went to jail was me and my mom out of 100 cases. And he aired this on the news, like this is statistics. And then anyone else just got off with like probation and stuff. But they sentenced my mom, who's never even had a driving ticket, who's 55 years old, who will not even probably live another 30 years. And you're like, if she messes up and goes to prison now, that's where she'll be at until she dies. All because of something that was really stupid. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have been punished. That's not what I'm saying. You do something, you should definitely be punished. Same thing with my kids. I tell them this all the time, you know. But to be so much, and like I said, I feel like our color played a part in this. It really did.
Ziva, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, the statistics show, you know, that's why at Reveal it was important to us to get into the data and get past the anecdotes and the stories, and the statistics do show disparity. Native women are locked up at 3 times their representation of the population. Black women, there's twice, you know, the representation. It's sometimes with the way the Census Bureau categorizes Hispanic women, it's difficult to measure. I'm sure that there's more of a disparity there. On top of that, there were wild differences in terms of sentence length. So our main character in the story was from Stevens County. They're number 3 per capita in locking up women statewide. She got a 20-year sentence for a first-time drug felony. And so you have a lot of cases where you have 7 women doing life in prison in Oklahoma for drug cases because of our 3 strikes you're out law. And so we have, you know, the 85% law, which requires people convicted of certain crimes to serve 85% of their sentences. And then you have a 3 strikes you're out law. So these things combine to really lengthen sentences. So we did find some disparities based on where you live and what color you are.
I want to follow up with you about this. The generational aspect, how these incarceration rates seem to jump from generation to generation. What else did your data find?
Yes, we found our main character, there's a very sad scene in the beginning of our story, and you can read it on revealnews.org. Her daughter was in Mabel Bassett at the same time, so they were both arrested for a methamphetamine case. And they sort of crossed paths in Mabel Bassett and couldn't talk because they were co-defendants. And so you have the traumatic event of taking the mother out of the home. There's a lot of research that shows the impact of early childhood trauma, sexual abuse, physical abuse, a mother missing from the home does have a huge impact, and then the educational attainment of the child suffers, which sort of begins a downward spiral. And so there's been a lot of research about early childhood trauma, and it definitely, all of the women we talked to across the board had very traumatic stories about rape and sexual assault, those kinds of things. And then taking the mother out of the home, just compounds those problems.
I'll go to you, Patricia, and then I'll get you in, Steve.
I just want to throw this in real quick because you had said about the mothers and the daughter that, okay, so here in Oklahoma, we only have the 2 prisons, okay? But if you are related, if me and you are sisters and we are on the same yard, we're not allowed to talk because we're sisters, not because co-defendants, but they do have that rule about the co-defendants.
Yes.
But if you are related, like, so if me and my mom would have went, she would have had to go to Mabel Bassett and I would have had to go to Eddie's or something. But if we cross paths, we're not to communicate.
That's correct.
or anything.
There were 2 reasons why our main character, Robin Allen, couldn't talk to her daughter in prison. One was because she was her daughter, and one was because they were co-defendants. So it's a sad situation, but the common denominator is lack of education, early childhood trauma, not enough resources to investigate these issues and deal with them. And so it begins a path of addiction that's not treated. And sort of those early issues, like both of these gentlemen have said, have to be solved.
In everything that I've read about you, Steve, you always bring up the issue of families and children, that is really where your focus is in trying to improve the lives of families and children in this state. When you hear stories like this about the intergenerational aspect, what can be done to break that cycle?
Well, once again, as I'd indicated, I think we need to be much more proactive in our juvenile courts. Sometimes it just
What
takes...
does that mean when you say proactive in
Well,
juvenile?
when I was up in Washington County, rural county north of Tulsa, it was kind of unheard of in doing a deprived child action without removing children. And that made no sense to me. I was hearing stories of neglect and depravity, but not enough to remove children, and yet those are children in a bad environment, and you need to just get those parents in front of a judge and say, hey, you're screwing up. We don't want to take your kids. Can we help you with resources so that you can learn to be better parents? By the time I left Washington County, went to Tulsa County, I would venture to say 50% of our children cases were non-custodial type cases, where the whole goal was just infuse them with resources on the front end and then hopefully prevent their children from becoming delinquent or adult offenders, and hopefully teach the parents how to do a better job parenting. I'm a parent and my wife's a professional. We've got 3 daughters. I firmly believe through my faith that every person is a child of God, and they have a destiny, and I want them to realize that. And so in Tulsa County, one of the things we're very fortunate about, and this is probably the bigger conversation, I have friends in other states who have the exact same issues facing them. Tulsa County is very blessed because we have a very proactive nonprofit community, and they're sharing resources. A true reality of what goes on in Oklahoma is my office is funded less than 50% from the state. I have to come up with other ways to fund my office. These nonprofits have started to recognize maybe there ought to be some kind of public-private partnership. So thank goodness for the Women in Recovery program, because they are able to hear our voice and capitalize on it and say, all right, what can we do to make the system better? Rather than kind of pointing a finger and saying, you're the reason for the problem, we're joining together to be the solution. The other part about it, and it's just how you train your prosecutors, I tell my people, I said, listen, you're not going to benefit as a society if you're putting people in prison all the time. You got to figure out who that person is right across from you. That's an individual. You can't cookie cutter that person into this is how we always do it. You got to find out more about that person to figure out where they're coming from, how they got there, and what it's going to take to get them fixed. And then finally, it takes that person's desire to want to be fixed. I can only bring the horse to water. I can't make the horse want to drink. So many times when you're dealing with addictive issues, you've got to get first past the addiction to help them realize, all right, now we got you cleaned up. How do we keep you out of the system? So it's much more labor intensive, but much more rewarding on the back end.
Do you believe prison's a deterrent?
Sure. Yeah, in many
Why?
instances. Well, I mean, I just got done prosecuting a guy who committed an armed robbery in one of my communities. He had previously got a robbery down in Texas, came to Oklahoma and goes in and commits an armed robbery at gunpoint. He's going to prison, and he's learning a very stiff lesson, which is I probably shouldn't commit this kind of conduct in the future.
But what about the women who we're talking about
Well,
in this cohort?
it just depends, right? The conversation is defining justice. I don't think you can define justice without finding truth. There's always a story out there, and many of them can be very empathetic stories as delivered. We all have a truth, right? And it's whether we're being honest with ourselves about what has happened in our lives. I've dealt with many people, women and men, who have a lot of problems with addiction, and they will come up with a number of excuses to explain why they do what they do, but until they can get to the reason to answer the question, why are they doing it, you're never going to get that person rehabilitated. So the hardest part is always getting those people to answer, why are you doing this? And when they can get down that deep, then they start realizing the error of their ways. Of course, do I want to put the people I'm angry at in prison? No. That's the difference. I divide up prosecutions and the people I'm afraid of, the people who are committing murders, rapes, robberies, and then there's that other group that we're talking about, the ones you're angry at, who you're just like, would you please stop stealing? Would you please stop doing drugs? And it takes a lot of resources to help those people.
Patricia, from the people that you were with when you were in prison, do you believe prison was actually a deterrent for them?
I was going to say, let me say this first. Earlier you made a comment saying that when you're in a smaller town, that you have the people, like, they're stealing, they were doing other things. I was not doing other things. I have never been in trouble. I have not caused any problems in my town. This was my first offense, and this is what happened to me. Now, I know, like, there's other people in the world that have happened to. It's just unfortunate for me. But I just wanted to make that a point that I wasn't doing anything. There were no other crimes. There was nothing else. This was it.
I will probably just... I don't know enough about your case other than what I've read in the paper, but I'm sure that maybe the local law enforcement might have a different story, but I'd like to see that before I comment.
Well, I would like you to look that up too, because just so you can know for yourself, just for you,
I'll be glad
so you know. But another thing that I was going to say, prison is not rehabilitation. I was not a criminal when I went in there. I knew nothing about how to survive or do anything in the prison system until I got there. I can honestly tell you, some of these girls are going in there just a little lost, okay? But now we're screwing them up because we're coming out and we're all jacked up. I'm jacked up, my sister's jacked up. It's a lot. This is not rehabilitation.
Kris, is this what you see with the women that you work with?
Yes, so I tend to agree with Patricia. The reality is this. We are literally incarcerating more people than we ever have in the history of our state. If incarceration alone were a deterrent, our crime rates would be decreasing.
Right.
They're not. In fact, in many cases, they're increasing in certain categories. And let me just very quickly unpack what Patricia has just said. Here's the reality. When a low-level offender, and let me just be clear, because we have to base this conversation on the facts. In 2015, which is the last complete set of data that we have of who is entering the Department of Corrections in Oklahoma, 75%, 3 out of 4 of the individuals who were admitted to DOC custody in 2015 were for nonviolent offenses. That's the reality of what's happening.
And many of them were first-time felonies, too.
Many of them were first-time convictions as well. So that's the reality of what's happening in our state. Anecdotally, there may be some stories that are different than that, but statistically, 3 out of 4 are nonviolent offenders. Very quickly, here's what happens. When a nonviolent offender enters a period of incarceration, it can be a short period of time, it can be a long period of time. In fact, the studies that I've read indicate that the longer the period of time, the less likely that person is going to successfully transition back into the community. But they come back into the community now as a convicted felon. Let me be very clear, that felony conviction stays with that person for life. For life. It's a scarlet letter that excludes that person from participating pro-socially in the community. It knocks them out of most job opportunities, most housing opportunities. It limits their ability to pro-socially participate in the community. They have enormous fees and fines that they have to pay back in conjunction with their sentence because, oh, by the way, we're funding the majority of our criminal justice system on the backs of people who commit crimes today, and it's wrong. So they have to pay back these fees and fines they have a family to take care of. Statistically, 84% of the women who are in prison in Oklahoma are moms. 72% have a child under the age of 16, one or more children under the age of 16. So they have a family to take care of after they pay back the fees and fines, but no place to live, no place to work. And then on top of that, whatever the core issue is that's driving the antisocial behavior, if it's addiction or mental illness, they're still battling that issue because they didn't receive the help, the treatment, the programming while they were in prison. It's not there. It doesn't exist. Matter of fact, if we're going to be honest, let me just tell you, if a person wants to use the entire time they're in prison in Oklahoma, they can use the entire time they're in prison in Oklahoma. They can if they want to. It's available.
Kris?
So they come out still battling that core addiction. And then the last thing I would just say, according to the research, individuals pick up additional antisocial behavior from being in that environment.
Yeah.
That's what Patricia is saying. If they weren't messed up before, they sort of don't get the help that they need, and they pick up these antisocial behavior. And it does not lead to positive outcomes. In fact, it often makes a bad situation worse. I'll end by saying this. If something doesn't change and change soon, we're going to need to rename our Department of Corrections because we're not correcting anything.
I think the question I have for you after that is, so what's a district attorney to do? They have to do their job. What can be done to help district attorneys do their job in a more effective way so that we don't have to have conversations like this?
Alison, I have waited for 16 years for somebody to ask me how a district attorney ought to do his or her job. Teasing. I'm teasing. Listen, I have tremendous respect. I have respect for Steve. I have respect for all the district attorneys in the state of Oklahoma. The short answer is this: we have to work together. We have to work together. We have to see the value in addressing the core issues. We have to be smart about how we can do that. We have to understand that when we have a broken system, it doesn't make any sense to continue to fund or even fund that broken system at greater levels. We have to work together to seek treatment over punishment for people who battle addiction and mental illness. We have to be smart about the programmings within our communities that we can collectively support that will strengthen families and help individuals reach their full potential. And we have to understand that a person is so much more than their worst moment or their mistake in life. And we have to work together to get to that point. And then, last thing I would say, as a community, collectively, we have to support our district attorneys who are willing to and our judges and our elected officials who are willing to step out and support a paradigm shift in the way that we administer justice and corrections in the state of Oklahoma.
That brought me to my next question. That brings me to you, Steve. What is it that you need from Kris's community to help? If you want to work together, what is it you need from the advocacy community?
Follow through on what you just said.
That's fair. That's fair.
Kris was down there back in 2008, 9, 10 when we had a justice reinvestment initiative, tried to parrot it after Texas, had the cooperation of district attorneys, and the whole idea was let's start focusing on this problem. It was a two-part process. You passed the law to create the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, and we'll fund it. Funding never came. I've said this before. My office, less than 50% of my budget comes from the state of Oklahoma. I can cooperate as much as you'd like me to, but if you don't pay the guardian, the public safety servants to do their job, what you do is create this vicious cycle where I hire people at $40,000 a year, and then they end up leaving after 3 years. You want the best and the brightest minds staying in these positions for the longest period of time, but when you eviscerate the ability of public servants to protect their community and have some kind of continuity of purpose, you undercut all the goals. So we cooperate, and we have been cooperating, but it takes a commitment by the community to say that the core responsibility of government, first and foremost, is pay the guardian. You can't have a community survive unless the guardians of the community, and I'm talking about police, fire, IMSA, courts, judiciary, and district attorneys. If you don't make sure that those central parts of the system are funded, you end up having this awful cycle.
Alison, can I say one thing?
I do want to save time for
Yeah.
people in the audience, though.
Oh.
I want to, actually, my next question is Ziva, but I'm going to ask one more question if we get the mics out to the audience because we have about 10 minutes left. Ziva, you've heard this back and forth. You've heard Patricia's part in this. Help me out with the data.
Yeah, I was just going to say the data shows that actually people like Steve and judges in Tulsa are working together because the decrease, the number of years women are serving for possession has gone down about 2 years. In Tulsa, it's gone up everywhere else. And those are not women in recovery women, okay? Those women, the women in recovery group are not they're not going to prison. So that means that there has been a change in mindset in Tulsa among judges and prosecutors. They are working with the folks at Women in Recovery, and there is cooperation there. And you know, the record shows that JRI did pass. Kris worked very hard, other people worked very hard. Frankly, at the time, the governor didn't support it, and the political will was not there to do it. It's interesting to see that has changed. And so, but you know, in the past, the political will was not there in Oklahoma City to support that reform.
All right, we have 10 minutes left exactly. I do want to take some questions, and I see a gentleman right there.
Good afternoon. Aaron Wendelboe with the University of Oklahoma College of Public Health. Lots of questions, but I will limit it just to one.
Please.
We have not talked about religion, and I feel like Oklahoma is largely Christian. I know there's other faiths as well. The word justice comes up in the Christian belief as well as mercy. And I'm just wondering, to what extent is there separation of church and state? And at what point among the players is there a belief that because of my religious beliefs about what justice means, how is that playing out in what justice is termed in the legal framework?
That's a really good question.
I actually had that question. I'm so glad you asked it because both of you gentlemen have mentioned faith when you talk about the work you do. Do you want to take the gentleman's question?
Sure. Anybody who's known me, I'm Catholic. I have no problem living my faith. I like being Catholic because there's a lot of guilt associated with that. I look at my life as being I'm going to live and die, and I hope to get to the next best place. So I'm going to be judged on the truth. And so what I have to do as a servant, whether I'm a political leader, a district attorney, or just a servant in my community, is focus on what the truths are. I can't drive down a road in Tulsa sometimes without seeing a homeless person and figure out we got a problem there. Mm-hmm. I can't recognize that things are working peachy when we have a mental ill population that can't even access services. I cannot ignore that from my faith perspective, nor from my district attorney perspective. So in many respects, I have to advance a social cause that necessarily, I would say, sir, from my background, necessarily always are going to intersect. What I say is it's kind of fun being Catholic because you can be really conservative and really liberal at the exact same time. And so I just try and encourage the people in my office. I don't preach what they ought to do from a religious standpoint, but from a very servant approach. What does your fellow man need? If they're a victim of a violent crime, make sure that the violent offender doesn't come back a second time to victimize somebody else. If they are a defendant who is mired in drug abuse or has been the victim of child abuse and it's affecting everything they do, try and help them get better so that they can live the life that they were ordained to live.
Kris, do you have anything to add?
Sure. So I think it's a great question, and I think it's a question that ought to be raised and ought to be pressed, quite honestly, because we are, and we boast about being the buckle of the Bible Belt. And if I'm going to be honest, if we're going to have an honest conversation, I want to tell you I have observed individuals, officials using their faith as justification to exclude and belittle and hurt other people. I've seen it. I think key components of the Christian faith include grace and mercy and forgiveness and redemption and second chances. So as we have a conversation, and restorative justice, as we have a conversation about accountability for our elected officials who want to use their faith, and I'm not accusing people who sincerely believe what they believe, but I think we want to make sure that the faith also includes components that are extremely valuable and are intended to help others.
We have a question. Where's the mic? Right here?
Hi, my name is John Thompson. I retired from John Marshall in Centennial High School. And poor kids in Oklahoma County have an economic future projection below that of Baltimore County, with poor girls being way below. We're number one in the country with our kids having survived 4 or more traumas. When they come together in schools like where I taught at Centennial with these intense concentrations of kids who've been traumatized so much, we need far more social and emotional supports. How do we bring our public schools into this conversation to face up to the realities that people are honestly discussing here, but we don't want to face up to when it comes to our public schools?
Do you want to take that, Peter?
Well, I mean, that's a big topic, and I'm not a policy, I'm a journalist, and I looked at the way Oklahoma spends its money, and frankly, we have, 100 school districts where kids are going to school 4 days a week. And so it's very difficult for the schools to even keep the doors open and do the basic job of educating. Poverty plays a huge role in this. I think there was a study from Johns Hopkins in 2014 that Oklahoma ranked #1 in the nation in the number of those serious traumas. They had a list of them that kids underwent, and there's a lifetime impact. So you're exactly right, that those early traumas all feed into it. If there were money for counselors, there were money for people to provide services in schools, I think it would be great, but they can barely keep the doors open as it is.
Got a question in the back there? Young woman? Oh, there's a woman in the back, and then I'll get to you
And then
next.
front.
Then.
Good afternoon. My name is Mariana Adams, and my question is for the district attorney. My question is, how does privatization of prisons relate to mass incarceration? And do you believe that individuals should profit off of incarcerating people, specifically officials or those who influence officials?
Kris had said something earlier, and I agreed with him. I've often thought it was an oxymoron to call it the Department of Corrections, because the evisceration of the services available within our incarceration system have gone. I can't imagine incarcerating a person who has committed sex crimes and just warehousing them without trying to figure out, how do I get this person to understand the defect in their reasoning. With programs, the Department of Corrections is being a lot more proactive lately. I think Candace Moore is here, who works within community sentencing with the state of Oklahoma, in trying to find a way to have kind of a women's diversion program, which is highly intensive, investing the therapy that is absent behind the criminal walls. It's, in my opinion, it's very problematic that my expectation is somebody's going to go in and learn a little bit about why they got themselves in that position in the first place, but without those services available to deal with some of the complex issues of mental health or drug addiction, it is crippling.
But she's talking about the issue of private prisons.
Okay, and on private, secondarily, right, in private prisons, the reality is this is a public problem, and our legislature is going to have to figure out how they want to prioritize how we're going to administer our criminal justice system. That was a legislative decision. My job is follow the law, enforce the law, let the courts determine what's an appropriate punishment. That is a legislative issue and a legislative solution.
you're champing at the bit on this one.
A little bit, yeah. So let me
A little bit?
let me answer that. I'm not for sure, but let me just tell you this. Here's where I'm at. I think it's immoral. I think there's a perverse incentive, and please hear me because I want to be clear. I want to be fair about this. I think there's a perverse incentive built in for anybody who wants to make money off the backs of people's weaknesses or people who commit crimes. I think it's wrong for the private industry to do so. But let me be clear. If it's wrong for the private industry, it's equally wrong for government. Here's the reality. I've got 10 seconds. Here's the reality. The Department of Corrections, and I want to be clear about this, missing from this conversation is the fact that Oklahoma also has the highest ratio of inmates to correctional officers per capita of any state in the nation. My hat's off to the men and women who work for the Department of Corrections. I think they're doing the dead level best they can, given the limited resources they have. I agree with Steve on that, but here's the deal. The individuals, when they can't be placed in the Department of Corrections because there's no room, they're housed in county jails. And the Department of Corrections pays those county jails to house them until they can be placed. The Department of Corrections recently canceled like 10 contracts with 10 different counties because they couldn't afford to reimburse those counties. The counties, every one of them banded together and they sued the Department of the Corrections and they said, you can't do that. We use that funding as a source of revenue for our counties. If it's wrong for the private industry, it's wrong for county government as well.
And Kris, I'll cut a deal with you. How about you and I go down to the legislature and you convince them to fully fund DA offices so that I don't have to collect my fees off of the backs of these people you're championing. I don't like it any more than you do.
All right, I think we're going to end on the fist bump.
Yes.
I think we're going to end on the fist bump. Please, everybody, thank our panel.
Thank you very much, Kris.